So a while back I made a video which asked what if Daenerys stayed in Essos, and a lot of you have asked for a part 2, so here it is. But before we get into it, let's do a little recap. Essentially, Daenerys decides she no longer wants the Iron Throne and decides to remain in Essos, conquering Slaver's Bay and the Basilisk Isles, before securing the Dothraki Sea, then the lands of Lazar and the city of Mantares, followed by Karth and the Red Waste, and eventually her greatest conquest, Volantis and the city surrounding it. But years of conquest have taken a toll. She's lost many warriors, many friends, and even a dragon, Rhaegal, and the remaining 3 cities have formed a coalition against her should she continue to march west. So instead she consolidates her power and rules over her empire for the next 30 years, during which time she adopts and then naturalizes 6 children, sending each one to govern different parts of her empire. There is Aerion, who rules over Karth and the Red Waste. There is Keisha Quo, who rules the Dragon Isles, formerly known as the Basilisk Isles, and is named Protector of the Summer Sea. A Dothraki named Erika, who is named Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea. A Volantene named Sarah, who rules over the lands of Lazar, and eventually bonds with the dragon Viserion. Then Jaren, who rules over Volantis. And finally Daenerys' eldest child, Kala, who is named Imperial Heir and remains in Meereen. And after the death of Daenerys, Kala is named Empress. All across Meereen and the Empire as a whole, bells rung out to signify the death of Empress Daenerys, and tens of thousands crowded the streets of Meereen to witness the coronation of Empress Kala, uncertain of what the future of the Empire would look like, as Kala was no dragon rider, and as far as she knew, she had no Valyrian blood. But that would have to wait, as she was faced with a more direct problem. It came from the city of Volantis. Naturally, Jaren, the Lord of Volantis, had left the city to witness his sister's coronation, and while he was gone, the last of the old blood aristocracy of Volantis rose up in rebellion. Several of the most powerful families in Volantis, alongside their supporters and guards, 3 commanders of the City Watch, and even a sellsword company, launched an uprising in the eastern portion of the city. They were able to capture the council chambers of Volantis and the streets surrounding it, as well as the great eastern gatehouse of the city. But Imperial loyalists successfully retook the gatehouse, so the rebels secured their positions and dug in, taking hundreds of hostages in the process. When news reached Meereen, Jaren immediately boarded a ship and headed straight back to Volantis, sailing across the Bay of Dragons to Tolos, where he then went across the Demon Road to get to Volantis. But while travelling in the shadow of the Painted Mountains, his force was attacked by bandits. After a bloody battle, Jaren's forces defeated the bandits, capturing several who revealed that they had been paid off by the Volantene rebels to slay Jaren. By the time the Lord of Volantis returned to his city, he was furious. Where his advisors handed him a list of demands that the rebels had made, Jaren didn't even read it. Instead, he sent a message to the rebels, ordering them to surrender by this exact time the next day, otherwise he would personally end each one of their bloodlines. True to his word, the next day, when the deadline ended, he ordered his forces to attack, led by the elite and heavily armoured Imperial Knights. The city's garrison stormed the rebel positions. The fighting was intense, lasting throughout the day and night and into the next day, but hopelessly outnumbered, eventually the rebels were defeated, and the rebels were cut down to a man. After that, Jaren had his knights scour the city, slaying anyone who shared blood with the rebels, in what became known as the Night of 1,000 Tears. Back in Meereen, the Imperial Senate praised Jaren for his quick and decisive action in putting down the rebellion, thus stopping it from spreading throughout the Empire. The Empress did not share their beliefs, however, for the death toll was great. Thousands were dead, including all of the hostages, and hundreds more had been slain by Jaren's knights, including many children. In Kala's eyes, Jaren had acted too rashly, and his willingness to massacre his own people disturbed her greatly. A scolding letter was sent to Jaren, but the only reply the Empress ever got was a single sentence saying, "What's done is done." But with the rebellion crushed, the Empire returned to peace. And it was a time of peace and prosperity all throughout the Empire. But there was still one major issue to deal with: Drogon, the great dragon of Empress Daenerys, who at the death of his mother had begun to act very strange. He stood vigil over the tomb of Daenerys day and night. Anyone who got close, even those who Drogon knew, were met with hostility from the dragon. Viserion was likewise devastated by the loss of their mother, but had found comfort with their new rider, Sarah, and Viserion seemed happy in their home of Lazar. But Drogon showed no signs of recovering from his mother's death. It almost almost seemed like Drogon was depressed. But could dragons be depressed? No one in the Empire could answer that. Unsure of what to do, the Empress ordered that no one go near Drogon. Food would be brought to him daily, but apart from that he would be left alone. She also ordered that her scholars scour the libraries of the Empire to try and find some bit of lore that might explain what was going on with Drogon. Karla then concluded that she'd done all she could for the dragon and now had to look to the governance of her empire. For the next several years, the Empire enjoyed relative peace and prosperity. Karla was content to let the provinces of the Empire largely rule themselves, and this policy worked very well. In Karth, Aerion had begun to resettle the cities that had been destroyed by the Dothraki, and was even planning on creating settlements on the north of Great Morak in order to take full advantage of the trade coming through the Jade Gates. In the lands of Lazar, construction had been finished on a new great city. It was named Queen's Gaze, and was declared a city worthy of the great shepherd himself. And in Sulfuriel, more and more settlements were springing up throughout the Dragon Isles, as wave upon wave of adventurers came to these lands, seeking out their fortunes. Although plague was an ever-present threat in these lands, and despite the best efforts of healers from the Summer Isles and Nath, many settlers still fell victim to the diseases that infected this land. In fact, the only part of the Empire that did not seem prosperous was the Dothraki Sea. Since the death of Daenerys, the Dothraki had become ever more isolationist and difficult to deal with. Even though the Dothraki, alongside their Khaleesi, Irika, had bent the knee and sworn fealty to Empress Karla, they seemed to have no interest in actually being part of the Empire. The Dothraki rarely sent their representatives to the Imperial Senate, and when they did turn up, they were of little help and often caused a lot of issues, such as riding their horses around the Senate chambers, and messages and emissaries sent to Vaes Dothrak were largely ignored. Empress Karla largely ignored the Dothraki, which many considered to be foolish, and many more believed that she should bring the Dothraki back into line by force if necessary, for it was feared that if this was allowed to continue, the Dothraki might break away from the Empire entirely. While this was going on, another strange event took place. Drogon, after 3 years of standing vigil, finally took flight and flew to the Isle of Cedars, which was largely uninhabited. Drogon would remain on the Isle of Cedars for many years. The Empress ordered that a small expedition be sent to the Isles to monitor Drogon. During her 8th year of rule, Karla decided to enact one of her great plans, a series of great roads which would connect all the cities of the Empire together. These would not be dirt tracks, no, these would be large, beautiful brick roads. There would be way stations, taverns and inns placed all along these roads. These would be placed alongside watchtowers and outposts, and there would be constant patrols running the length of these roads. Considering just how large the Empire was, this would be no small task, and it would certainly not be cheap either. The treasury was full, yes, but this venture would be very costly, and Karla would have to find additional funds to ensure that she would not bankrupt the Empire. Luckily for her, those new funds would just be round the corner, in the form of the Ibbenese and the Sarnori. In the 9th year of Karla's rule, she was approached by emissaries of both these realms. They were both very keen to reclaim their holdings on the mainland, which had been destroyed by the Dothraki in centuries prior. The Sarnori especially had once been a mighty kingdom, but because of the Dothraki they had been whittled down to little more than a single impoverished city. They were very keen on reclaiming their lost cities and rebuilding their kingdom. Likewise, the Ibbenese wished to reclaim their lost settlements such as Ibish, and in order to achieve this they were both willing to pay the Empress large amounts of gold and other materials, enough gold to see Karla's great road project become a reality. The only assurance that the Ibbenese and Sarnori asked for was that the Dothraki would not interfere, and Karla swore they would not. This would prove to be one of the greatest mistakes of her reign, as she never even consulted her sister on this. The Dothraki consider the earth to be sacred, and the building of cities defiles that, and the rebuilding of cities within the Dothraki Sea itself was simply too much for them to take. Irika personally travelled to Meereen to confront confront her sister on this. She demanded that Kala renounce this agreement and leave the cities alone. Kala rejected this. The cities had been abandoned for centuries. It would make no difference to the Dothraki if they were resettled. Erika countered, saying it would be a desecration of everything the Dothraki believed in. Kala replied by saying the gold being offered would be more than enough to pay for the road network, and that the Empire would truly be united. Erika simply laughed, claiming that she had no interest in Kala's vanity project. Becoming increasingly annoyed, Kala reminded her sister that they needed allies against the free cities. Erika simply replied that the free cities were weak and could not stand against the Empire. This back and forth between the two would go on for another 3 hours, until finally, realizing that she was getting nowhere, Erika left, stating that the Dothraki would do whatever it takes to protect their land. Kala replied that their land was her land. She was Empress. They owed her their allegiance. Erika's response was simple yet blunt. We bowed to the dragon, and you are no dragon. And with that, the two sisters never spoke again. Interestingly, however, the Dothraki did not attack straight away. It would be 2 years before any conflict arose between them, and when conflict arose, it was a simple series of raids against the Ibbenese and Sarnori. It would seem that no matter what she had said, Erika was not prepared to tear the Empire apart, but she would have to act soon. And in the 3rd year of this conflict, under increasing pressure from the Dosh Kalim, Erika gathered a Khalasar 60,000 strong and marched to war. First, her great Khalasar smashed the Ibbenese, sacking the settlement of Ibish, which was still largely in ruin, before moving on to New Ibish, sacking the city and driving the Ibbenese from the mainland. In response, the Ibbenese saw eternal hatred against the Empire, proclaiming that they would never be friends to the House of the Dragon. The Dothraki then turned westwards to face the Sarnori, who, realizing what was happening, retreated back to their home city of Sarth. When news reached Meereen, the Empress was enraged, and she called her banners and made ready for war. Sarah flew Viserion to Meereen, desperately hoping to avoid a civil war. But when she confronted her sister, Kala simply smiled. Erika was simply acting out. The Dothraki needed to be put back in their place. It would not come to bloodshed. Sarah told her sister that the Dothraki had come too far. They would not simply back down at the sight of her army. Kala stared at her sister and said, I will bring the might of the Empire to bear against the Dothraki. They will submit or they will be crushed. It is that simple. Horrified by this, Sarah said, You're going to face the Dothraki in open field? Are you mad? Only a fool would do that. Kala simply said, You do not need to worry, dear sister. This does not affect you. Fly back to your city. Now, dismissing a dragon rider during a time of potential war may seem a bit strange, but Kala had grown increasingly paranoid of her sister over the years. Her sister was a dragon rider, just like their mother. Kala was not. Some within the Empire whispered that it should be Sarah and not Kala who was Empress. Because of this, Kala wanted to keep her sister as far away from any potential glory as possible. Instead of flying back to Lazar, Sarah flew straight to Saf. Flying ahead of the Dothraki Khalasar, Viserion burned a great tract of land right in front of them, stopping the Dothraki in their tracks. Viserion then landed and Sarah dismounted. She then walked calmly right through the centre of the Dothraki camp. She held her arms out to either side to show that she was no threat, but the Dothraki still cowered away. She continued to walk until she arrived at Erika's tent. Erika met Sarah coldly. Return to Lazar and leave this matter to me, Erika said. I cannot do that, sister. Armies are marching and civil war draws close. If it is to be civil war, then Kala would have started it. And you're going to finish it, are you? If that is the case, let my life be the first you take. Erika looked at her sister confused. It is not a trick, dear sister, nor will I fight you. But know this, you're about to destroy everything our mother built. Everything she wanted to build, and all of her dreams. I can't watch that happen, sister, so take my life first. It would be a kindness. But know this, if you kill me, you'll have to kill Viserion too. And I doubt he'll be as accommodating as I am. Maybe you'll be able to do it, but thousands of your people will die. Then you'll have to fight Kala's army, weakened. Erika stepped back, unsure what to say. Then finally she spoke. So what do you propose then? Meet with the Sarnori, talk to them. To hell with Kala and her demands. Make your own demands, hammer out an agreement, negotiate a peace. negotiations. Yes, negotiations. You have two choices. Accept it, or we will all die here. Erika, frustrated and annoyed, nodded her head and returned to her tent. A few hours later, Sarah returned with some of the Sarnori leaders, and the two sides met and talked and argued and shouted and threatened each other for hour after hour after hour. But eventually, and painstakingly, an agreement was hammered out. The Sarnori could resettle the lands around the Sarn Delta, but they could not go any further south than that. They would also have to pay a yearly tribute to the Dothraki, but they would not have to give the Empress anything, and in exchange for all of this, they would have the protection of the Dothraki. Although not the best deal for either side, it averted war, and that was the main thing. Back in Meereen, however, the Empress was beyond furious. Sarah had disobeyed her orders. She had taken all the glory for herself, and she had deprived Kala of the gold she desperately needed. Kala's paranoia then reached a new high. She became convinced that Sarah and Erika were plotting together, and she began to see enemies and assassins everywhere. The next year, Drogon suddenly took flight from the Isle of Cedars and began flying eastwards towards the Shadowlands and Asshai. Those who saw Drogon claimed that he seemed to be almost fleeing from something, but they did not know what. Upon investigation of Drogon's lair, they found a clutch of eggs. Now, whether or not these eggs were actually laid by Drogon or something else is not known, as the scholars who found them claimed that these eggs were ancient, perhaps dating back even to the old Valyrian freehold. Kala immediately had the eggs brought back to Meereen, where they were kept as hot as possible. The Empress had scholars, healers, maesters and even sorcerers from everywhere brought to Meereen to study these eggs and try to get them to hatch. This became her obsession, and she became convinced that she would usher in a new age of dragons. She would be the one who would fulfill her mother's dreams. And the next year, it looked like she might get that, as one of the eggs suddenly started to hatch. Dozens of dignitaries and observers from all around the known world gathered in the chamber to witness the birth of a new dragon. But what came out of that egg was no dragon. It was a grotesque, deformed, worm-like creature. It had no wings, it had no arms, and its face was almost human. As it writhed and squirmed, some of the dignitaries fled the room in horror. Its stench, like rotting flesh, assaulted the nostrils of everyone in the room. But worst of all was its screams, like a newborn child, but not quite, twisted and warped. This creature was a horror from old Valyria, and that is where the Empress ordered that this creature and the other eggs be sent to at once, and within a matter of a couple of hours they were shipped out of Meereen to Valyria. The captain of the ship claimed that by the time they got to Valyria, the worm had grown to the size of a small child. The creature's skin was hot to the touch, so hot in fact that they had to use thick gloves in order to hold it, and the creature's strength was immense. Captain also claimed that one of the other eggs was beginning to hatch, but they didn't stick around to see what came out of it. The Empress hoped and prayed that that would be the end of it, but how wrong she was. For a couple days later, members of the ship's crew began to fall ill with a strange disease. Their skin began to fall off, and underneath, strange fleshy growths that looked almost like dragon scale began to emerge. This was not like grayscale. The flesh was not necrotic or dying, it was alive and writhing and incredibly hot. And after a week of incredible agony, the crew members all died, but not before they passed it on to others. First dozens, then hundreds, and for half a year the gates to the city remained shut. No one was allowed in or out, as this plague, now dubbed dragon sickness, ravaged Meereen. Thankfully the Empress herself did not catch this disease, but her family were not so lucky. Her eldest son and heir fell victim to the plague, but almost as quickly as this disease emerged, it disappeared again. The surgeons believed that because of how quick this disease affected people, they did not have enough time to pass it on to others, thus the disease burned out quickly. Regardless of this, the city had been devastated. Nearly a fifth of the city's population had been wiped out, and Kala had become ever more reclusive and even more paranoid, rarely showing her face in public and never leaving the Great Pyramid. She became ever more indecisive, and her advisors had to practically run the empire for her. And when a new crisis emerged from out of the disputed lands, Kala was nowhere to be seen. That crisis was a young man calling himself Aemond Targaryen, the son of Aegon VI, the young Griff, the true king of the Seven Kingdoms. Aemon's father had been defeated by House Whiteflame of Westeros some years prior, but Aemon was adamant that being the last true-born Targaryen alive, he was the true Lord of House Targaryen and therefore the rightful ruler of the Empire. Regardless if he was truly who he claimed to be, he emerged from out of the disputed lands at the head of an army 50,000 strong, mostly made up of sellswords and mostly bought with gold given to him by the free cities. His army quickly destroyed an imperial host in the field and then laid siege to Volantis. While his city was under siege, Jaren sent messages to Meereen pleading for aid, but the response was sluggish. The Empress did not know what to do. Should she send emissaries to try and find a peaceful solution? Should she send armies to fight? But one thing she refused to do adamantly was send Viserion and Sarah to the battle. Seeing that no help was coming, Jaren decided to make his own plan for victory. He would use the would-be conqueror's impulsiveness against him. Jaren knew that Aemon had supporters in the city, and he also knew that they would try and seize one of the gatehouses, so he decided to let them. And in the early hours of the morning, Aemon awoke to find one of the city's gatehouses had their gates wide open and the banner of House Targaryen flying above it. He immediately mounted his horse and charged for the gate, ordering his army to follow, but his army was disorganized and confused, and only a few dozen of his knights were able to catch up with Aemon by the time he reached the gatehouse. And when he, alongside his knights, made it into the city, the gates slammed shut. And before he had a chance to react, a hail of arrows flew at his men, and spearmen charged from out of alleyways in the city, dragging his knights off their horses and cutting them down. Likewise, archers that had been hidden on the walls suddenly emerged and began raining down a storm of arrows upon his army outside, who were caught completely in the open and slaughtered. To his credit, Aemon slew over a dozen men-at-arms and knights, before being slain by none other than Jaren himself, who then ordered that the gates of the city be flung open. He then led his own charge of knights and heavy infantry, which smashed into the disorganized sellsword army that was outside, who broke almost immediately, realizing their king was dead. It was a decisive victory for the Imperial forces, but the campaign had been costly, and Jaren wanted to press on and crush the free cities, for he knew they had to be the ones who supplied Aemon with the gold for his sellswords. But Kala adamantly refused, and for a while at least, Jaren honestly considered just going anyway and finishing the job himself, but his sense of honour, which had been drilled into him by his old mentor Ser Jorah Mormont, would not let him. But Kala herself would not long survive this. Less than 2 years after the siege of Atlantis, Kala, the first of her name, died peacefully in her sleep. She ruled the empire for just over 16 years, and although her reign had many troublesome years, there were also plenty of good ones too, and the empire did flourish and prosper as a whole. She would be succeeded by her son and heir, Kaelor, a boy of 6, so her brother Merron declared a regency, naming himself as Grand Regent of the Empire. Merron was a cruel, gluttonous and corrupt man, and was hated by almost everyone in the Empire, especially among the other branches of House Targaryen, who demanded that Merron stand down immediately so that one of them could become regent instead. He refused point blank, but his reign would be a short one. For less than a month into his regency, Sarah descended from the sky riding Viserion, landing on top of the Great Pyramid, entering the throne room, slaying Merron's 2 sellsword guards, then slaying the supposed regent himself. Sarah would then be declared as the new regent of the Empire, but even this would not last long, for she had proven herself a warrior and a diplomat. She rode Viserion, she was the dragon, and her bloodline was secure in the form of her son Drakon, who had already proven himself a warrior. So by unilateral decision, Sarah was declared as Queen of the Dragon Isles and Bay of Dragons, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Shepherdess of Lazar, Lady of Volantis, Magistrix of Karth, Empress of the Greater Targaryen Empire. She would rule for many years. She would be succeeded by her son Drakon and his son after him, who would be succeeded by his son after him, and so on and so forth until the rise of Aenar the Unworthy, whose death would bring about the fall of the Seren dynasty and the first of the great schisms of the Empire. But those are tales for another day, if you're interested of course. Until then, I have been the Warmaster's Tavern. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, may you spend a half hour in heaven before the devil knows you're dead.